3:47 p.m., June 12, 1944. Frank Weber, 19 years old, a soldier in the German army, was eating his ration of rye bread in a dugout near Saint-Lô, France. Then he heard it, a sound he would never forget, a deep, pulsating roar that made the ground vibrate. His hands started shaking uncontrollably. The bread fell into the mud. His squad leader, Staff Sergeant Hank Dietrich, a veteran of the Russian front who had faced Soviet T-34 tanks without flinching, went pale. He whispered two words that every German soldier in France had learned to fear: the Jabos from hell. Jabo, short for Jagged Bomber, fighter bomber. But this wasn't just any aircraft. This was the sound of the P-47 Thunderbolt. And in those first 8 seconds, when the sound reached their ears, both men knew someone was about to die. 43 years later, in 1987, Frank Weber sat in a comfortable apartment in Hamburg, Germany. A historian from the University of Munich was interviewing him for a veteran's oral history project. When asked about his worst memory from the war, Weber went silent. His hands, now wrinkled and spotted with age, began to shake. The historian asked if he needed a break. Weber shook his head. Then he said something that would appear in dozens of academic papers about combat trauma. "I can still hear it. Every time a motorcycle passes, every time thunder rolls. I'm back in that dugout. That sound meant death. Not might mean death, not could mean death. Meant death. You heard the P-47 engine. You had maybe 10 seconds to pray." Weber wasn't alone. Between 1985 and 1995, researchers at the German Military History Research Office in Freiburg conducted extensive interviews with German Army veterans who had served on the Western Front after D-Day. Of the 847 veterans interviewed who had experienced P-47 Thunderbolt attacks, 712, that's 84%, reported that the sound of the aircraft's engine was their most traumatic memory. Not the explosions, not the casualties, not the defeat. The sound, the anticipation, the helplessness that came with hearing that unmistakable 2,800 horsepower roar. What made the P-47 Thunderbolt's engine sound so uniquely terrifying? The answer lies in both acoustics and psychology. The P-47 was powered by the Pratt and Whitney R2800 double wasp engine. This was not just any engine, it was an 18-cylinder, two-row radial engine that produced 2,800 horsepower, more raw power than any other single-engine fighter in World War II. When that engine was running at combat power, it created a sound frequency pattern that human ears processed as deeply threatening. The low-frequency pulses, around 20 to 80 hertz, triggered the same primitive fear response in the human brain as thunder, earthquakes, or the roar of large predators. But there was something else. The P-47's exhaust system created a distinctive rhythmic pulse that German soldiers could identify from over 2 miles away. It wasn't a smooth hum like a Spitfire. It wasn't the high-pitched scream of an Me-109. It was a deep, stuttering thrum, thrum, thrum that seemed to shake the AIR itself. And every German army soldier knew that sound was followed, within seconds, by one of 3 things: 8 Browning M2 50 caliber machine guns, each firing 800 rounds per minute, or 10 5-inch high-velocity aircraft rockets, each carrying a 60-pound warhead, or 2,500 pounds of bombs, including the new terror weapon, jellied gasoline napalm. Staff Sergeant Hank Dietrich, the squad leader who went pale in that dugout, survived the war. In a 1991 interview, he described his first encounter with a P-47 Thunderbolt in detail. It was June 9th, 1944, 3 days after D-Day. His unit, the 352nd Infantry Division, had been ordered to move from their positions near Bayeux to reinforce the collapsing defenses near Omaha Beach. They were moving in daylight, a desperate decision that everyone knew was suicide, but orders were orders. At 2:18 p.m., Dietrich heard the sound. He had served 2 years on the Russian front. He had survived Stalingrad. He knew the sound of aircraft engines, but this was different. This sound made his stomach clench. He screamed for his men to scatter. But scatter to where? They were on an open road, farmland on both sides, no trees, no buildings, nowhere to hide. The P-47 came in low, maybe 500 feet. Dietrich remembered seeing it clearly, the massive radial engine. The bubble canopy, the checkerboard markings on the nose. He remembered thinking how big it was, how solid, like a flying tank. Then the pilot opened fire. What happened next, Dietrich said, was like watching the ground being torn apart by an invisible monster. The 850 caliber machine guns, synchronized to fire through the propeller arc, created what American pilots called a cone of fire. Every second, 106 half-inch bullets, each one traveling at 2,900 feet per second, tore into a target area the size of a small car. Dietrich's truck disintegrated. One moment it was a vehicle, the next moment it was pieces. The driver, a 20-year-old kid from Bavaria named Wilhelm, simply ceased to exist. The bullets that hit him, and Dietrich guessed maybe 20 or 30 hit him in the first half second, didn't wound him. They erased him. The truck's engine block, solid cast iron weighing over 400 pounds, was torn free from its mounts and thrown 15 feet. The truck's frame, made of welded steel, was bent into a V-shape. But what Dietrich remembered most, what he described with shaking voice 47 years later, was the sound. Not the sound of the guns, the sound of the engine, even as the world exploded around him, even as men he had trained with were dying. The sound of that R-2800 engine filled everything. It was inside his head, inside his chest. He could feel it vibrating his bones, and he knew with absolute certainty that this sound meant he was supposed to be dead. The attack lasted 17 seconds. The P-47 made one pass and was gone. Of the 47 men in Dietrich's convoy, 23 were dead, 16 were wounded, 8, including Dietrich, were physically unharmed but psychologically shattered. And every one of them, according to after-action reports, reported the same thing. They recognized the P-47's sound before they saw the aircraft. The sound had given them maybe 5 seconds of warning, 5 seconds to experience pure, helpless terror before the guns opened fire. American pilots knew about the psychological effect. They talked about it. They used it. Captain Robert Bob Johnson, who flew P-47 Thunderbolts with the 56th Fighter Group out of England, described a mission briefing in April 1944 where his squadron commander explicitly mentioned the engine sound as a weapon. The commander, a West Point graduate named Lieutenant Colonel David Schilling, had recently received intelligence reports from captured German soldiers. The reports all mentioned the same thing. German army troops were abandoning defensive positions. When they heard P-47 engines, even before the aircraft came into view, Schilling told his pilots to use this. When approaching a ground target, don't come in silent with throttle reduced. Come in at full power. Let them hear you coming. Let the sound break them before the bullets do. It wasn't sadism, it was tactical psychology. A soldier who breaks and runs is less effective than a soldier who holds position and shoots back. And a soldier who is paralyzed with fear is the least dangerous of all. The tactic worked horrifyingly well. German after-action reports from June and July 1944 are filled with references to units failing to hold positions because of Jabos from hell panic. Commanders tried to address it, orders were issued, men were threatened with execution for cowardice. It didn't matter. The human nervous system doesn't care about orders. When you hear a sound that your brain has learned means death, your body floods with cortisol and adrenaline, your rational mind shuts down, and your primitive survival instinct takes over. Fight, flight, or freeze. And when you're facing a P-47 Thunderbolt, fighting is pointless, freezing is fatal. So you run. But then the pilots got clever. They realized that soldiers were learning to recognize the sound and immediately diving for cover. So some P-47 pilots started what they called the silent approach. They would reduce throttle and come in from high altitude in a steep dive, nearly silent except for wind noise, until the last possible moment. Then, at maybe 1,000 feet above the target, they would slam the throttle forward. The R-2800 engine would roar from 1,800 RPM to 2,700 RPM in less than 2 seconds. The sudden, explosive sound, combined with the visual of the diving aircraft, growing massive in your vision, created what one German veteran described as the sound of God's judgment. Lieutenant Frank Bauer, a platoon leader in the 17th SS Panzergrenadier Division, experienced the silent approach on July 15, 1944, near Caen. His unit was dug in around a farmhouse, preparing for the expected Allied offensive. The day was overcast, ceiling maybe 2,000 feet, light rain, poor flying weather. Bauer thought they were safe. He was writing a letter to his wife. Then the sky screamed. That's the only word Bauer could find to describe it in his 1989 memoir. The sky itself screamed. He looked up, and a P-47 was 200 feet above him, engine at full combat power, pulling out of a dive. The sound was so loud, it was physical. Bauer felt it hit his chest like a punch. The aircraft flashed overhead, and as it passed, he saw clearly the pilot's face, looking down at him. Then the rockets fired, 10 Havars, high-velocity aircraft rockets, each trailing white smoke. The farmhouse exploded. Bauer's radio operator, Staff Sergeant Schmidt, 32 years old, married with 2 children, was hit by a fragment and cut nearly in half. But what Bauer described in his memoir, what took up 3 full pages, wasn't the rockets or the death or the tactical situation. It was the sound. And specifically, what the sound did to him psychologically. He wrote, "I have tried for 45 years to explain this to my family, to my doctors, to myself. When I heard that sound, that particular roaring thunder, something broke in my mind. I was not brave anymore. I was not a soldier anymore. I was a terrified animal. I want to be clear about this. I was not afraid of death. I had faced death many times on the Russian front. I had assaulted Soviet positions. I had defended against Soviet attacks. I had felt fear. But I had controlled it. But the sound of the P-47 engine was different. It removed my ability to control anything. My body stopped obeying me. I urinated involuntarily. I pressed myself into the ground so hard I broke 2 ribs against a rock. I could not think. I could only feel terror." Bauer was not weak. His service record showed 4 years of continuous frontline combat. He had received the Iron Cross First Class for bravery. But the sound of the P-47's engine created a psychological trauma that standard courage could not overcome. And he was not unique. Dr. Heinrich Hoffmann, a German military psychiatrist who treated soldiers throughout the war and continued treating veterans for 40 years afterward, published a paper in 1986 specifically about what he called acoustic combat trauma. He interviewed 234 veterans who had served in France in 1944 and who were seeking treatment for what we now call PTSD. Of those 234, 187 identified specific sounds as their primary trauma trigger, and of those 187, 143, that's 76%, identified the P-47 Thunderbolt's engine sound as their specific trigger. Dr. Hoffman tried an experiment. He obtained recordings of various World War II aircraft engines. He played these recordings for his patients at low volume during therapy sessions. When he played recordings of German aircraft, Japanese aircraft, even British Spitfires, patients showed mild stress responses but remained functional. When he played the recording of a P-47 Thunderbolt at full power, even at low volume, the response was immediate and severe. Patients' heart rate spiked, blood pressure jumped. Several patients left the room. 2 patients had full panic attacks, requiring medical intervention. 1 patient, a 61-year-old former German Army artillery observer, vomited. Why was the P-47 sound so much more traumatic than other aircraft? Dr. Hoffman proposed several factors. First, the P-47 was overwhelmingly present. By July 1944, the U.S. Army Air Forces had over 1,200 P-47 Thunderbolts operating over France. That's not counting the ones based in Italy or the ones being used for training. German soldiers on the ground experienced P-47 attacks multiple times per day. The sound became associated, through repeated traumatic conditioning, with imminent death. Second, the P-47 was incredibly effective. The casualty rates from P-47 ground attack missions were obscene. A single P-47 on a single pass, carrying 10 HVAR rockets and 2,500 rounds of 50 caliber ammunition, could destroy an entire platoon. That's 30 to 40 men, gone in 30 seconds. Or it could knock out 3 or 4 tanks, or destroy an entire supply convoy. And the P-47 could make multiple passes. The aircraft was famous for its ability to absorb damage. One P-47 returned to base with over 200 bullet and shrapnel holes, so German ground fire was often ineffective. This created a sense of complete helplessness. You could hear death coming, and there was almost nothing you could do to stop it. Third, and this is perhaps most important, the P-47 attacked in conditions where other aircraft couldn't or wouldn't. The massive radial engine and the structural strength of the airframe meant P-47s could fly in weather that grounded other types. Overcast skies, the P-47, it operated. Rain, the P-47 operated. Low clouds, poor visibility, the P-47 operated. This meant that German soldiers never felt safe. Beautiful clear day, P-47s would find you. Terrible stormy weather that should have grounded all aircraft. Somehow, a P-47 would come through the clouds and ruin your day. Lieutenant Werner Schultz, a company commander in the 2nd Panzer Division, described this in a 1990 interview. After the war, Schultz became a music teacher in Stuttgart. He told the interviewer that he had a student who was learning to play the tuba. One day during a lesson, the student hit a particular low note and Schultz had a full flashback. He was suddenly back in France. Diving for cover, he said the tuba's low brass note at that particular pitch was close enough to the P-47's engine sound to trigger his trauma response. This wasn't just anecdotal. In the 1990s, researchers at the University of London conducted a study on acoustic signatures of World War II aircraft and their psychological impacts. They found that the P-47 Thunderbolt's R2800 engine produced a sound frequency pattern that was uniquely stressful to human hearing. The combination of low-frequency pulses, which create subconscious anxiety, mid-frequency roar, which demands attention, and the high-frequency exhaust crackle, which sounds like threat indicators, created what the researchers called an optimal fear response stimulus. Essentially, the P-47's engine sound accidentally pushed every button in the human fear response system. American pilots weren't consciously designing psychological warfare. They were just flying the aircraft. They were given. But the men who designed the P-47 had made decisions that accidentally created an acoustic terror weapon. The choice of the R-2800 engine wasn't about intimidation. It was about power and reliability. The exhaust system design wasn't about creating a frightening sound. It was about maximizing performance, but the combination created something that German soldiers feared more than the weapons themselves. Staff Sergeant Otto Kraus, who survived the war and became a police officer in Munich, described an incident in 1947. He was directing traffic at a busy intersection when an American military convoy came through. One of the vehicles was a captured German half-track that the Americans were using for transport. As it passed, Kraus heard a sound that made his heart stop. Another vehicle in the convoy had a large radial engine, not a P-47, just a truck with a radial engine, but close enough. Kraus had a panic attack in the middle of the intersection. He had to be taken to hospital. He resigned from the police force 2 weeks later. He couldn't handle the possibility of hearing that sound again. These weren't isolated cases. The German Veterans Association, in a 1988 internal survey, found that thousands of Western Front veterans reported ongoing sound-related trauma: thunderstorms, motorcycles, industrial equipment, even some musical instruments. Any sound that approached the P-47's acoustic signature could trigger severe responses. Decades after the war ended, your freedom, the freedom to live without that sound, meaning death, was built by the men who flew those P-47s. They didn't set out to create psychological terror. They set out to win a war and protect bomber crews and support ground troops. But in doing so, they created a weapon so effective that its sound alone could break enemy units. These pilots, many of them barely 20 years old, kids from small American towns who had never left their home state before the war, climbed into 1,700-500-pound machines every day and flew into deadly skies. They didn't do it for glory. They did it because it needed to be done. Sergeant Frank Morrison, a P-47 crew chief with the 406th Fighter Group, said it best in a 1995 interview. He had maintained P-47s throughout the war, keeping them flying, fixing battle damage, sometimes working 18-hour days, so the pilots would have aircraft ready. He said, "I didn't think about terror tactics or psychological warfare. I thought about keeping my birds flying. But looking back now, knowing what that sound meant to German soldiers, I'm proud, not proud of trauma, not proud of fear, but proud that American ingenuity and American industry created something so effective that the sound alone helped win the war. Those engines I kept running saved American lives. They shortened the war. They helped destroy Nazism. If the side effect was that some German soldiers got PTSD from the sound, well, they shouldn't have been fighting for Hitler." What's important to understand, what veterans on both sides emphasize, is that this wasn't about sadism or cruelty. This was about ending the war as quickly as possible. Every day the war continued. Thousands died. American pilots in P-47s, flying dangerous missions in aircraft that sounded like rolling thunder, were trying to save lives by ending the war faster. The fact that the sound alone caused psychological damage was secondary to the primary goal: winning. The numbers tell a story of industrial supremacy that Germany could never match. From 1942 to 1945, the United States produced 15 P-47 Thunderbolts. That's not variants or prototypes. That's 15,677 combat-ready aircraft, with that terrifying R-2800 engine. At peak production in 1944, Republic Aviation's factory in Farmingdale, New York, was delivering one complete P-47 every 90 minutes. 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. The workforce was largely women. Rosie the Riveter wasn't. Propaganda. She was real. Women like Mary Sullivan from Queens, who had never touched industrial equipment before the war, were assembling the most powerful single-engine fighter in the world. They worked the night shift. They worked through air raid drills. They worked knowing that every rivet they drove, every panel they installed, every engine they tested was going to fly into combat and maybe save an American life. The R-2800 engines that created that psychological weapon were built by Pratt and Whitney in factories across Connecticut and New Jersey. Each engine required 3,200 individual parts, all manufactured to tolerances measured in thousandths of an inch. Each engine was hand-assembled by skilled mechanics, tested for 50 hours on a test stand, then installed in an airframe. The quality control was so stringent that the R-2800 had a reliability rate unmatched by any other high-power aircraft engine of the war. They just kept running. They took battle damage and kept running. They flew in conditions that would ground other engines and kept running. German aircraft designers tried to copy the R-2800. They had captured intact P-47s. They had examples of the engine. They tore them down, measured everything, documented everything, but they couldn't replicate it. The manufacturing processes, the materials, the quality control systems. The German industry in 1944 simply couldn't match what American factories were doing routinely. This wasn't because German engineers were less skilled. It was because American industrial capacity and American production philosophy were fundamentally different. Major Herbert Weiss, a Luftwaffe technical intelligence officer who examined captured P-47s, wrote in his post-war interrogation report that the thing that shocked him most wasn't the specifications, it was the manufacturing quality. He said that examining a P-47 was like examining a watch. Everything fit perfectly. Everything was finished to a higher standard than comparable German aircraft. And the engine, that terrifying R-2800, was manufactured to a level of precision that Germany's bombing-disrupted factories simply couldn't achieve anymore. The psychological impact didn't end in 1945. Dr. Hoffman's research continued into the 1990s. He found that even as late as 1995, 50 years after the war ended, some German veterans still experienced acoustic trauma triggers. Modern jet aircraft sounded completely different, so that wasn't a problem. But certain industrial equipment, certain motorcycles, and yes, certain musical instruments could still trigger responses. In 1994, there was an air show in Munich where a restored P-47 Thunderbolt was displayed. The aircraft was in flying condition, and the organizers planned to do a flight demonstration. A veterans group asked the organizers to cancel the flight, not because of hard feelings, not because of resentment, but because several elderly veterans said they genuinely feared their psychological response to hearing that engine sound again. The organizers compromised. They did the flight demonstration, but announced it well in advance, encouraged veterans who might be affected to leave the area, and had medical personnel on standby. Even so, 3 elderly men in the crowd had panic responses when the P-47's engine started up. These men were in their 70s. The war had been over for almost 50 years, but that sound still had power over them. Frank Weber, the 19-year-old soldier we met at the beginning of this story, eating rye bread in a dugout near St. Lo, survived the war. He was captured by Canadian forces in August 1944, spent 2 years as a POW, and returned to Germany in 1946. He married, had children, became a teacher. He lived a long, mostly peaceful life. But in that 1987 interview, when the historian asked him what he wanted people to know about the war, Weber said something profound. He said, "I don't want sympathy. I was fighting for the wrong side. I know that now. I knew it then. Really. But I was 19 and following orders. What I want people to understand is that wars are won not just by brave soldiers, but by industrial capacity. America didn't just have better aircraft. America had so many aircraft that we couldn't fight them all. America had factories that could build complex, powerful engines faster than we could shoot down the planes they powered. And those engines, those magnificent machines, made a sound that broke our will before the bullets broke our bodies. That's the lesson. Industrial democracy defeated military dictatorship. The sound of the P-47 was the sound of American factories working around the clock. American women building weapons. American ingenuity applied to mass production. You couldn't fight that, not with courage, not with tactics, not with anything except your own industrial capacity. And we didn't have it. The P-47 Thunderbolt killed approximately 7,067 enemy aircraft. It destroyed over 6,000 armored vehicles. It demolished 132,000 railroad cars. It destroyed over 9,000 locomotives. But maybe its most effective weapon was never counted in after-action reports. It was the sound, the deep, pulsating roar of 2,800 horsepower that told every German soldier who heard it, your side is losing. Your weapons are inferior. Your industry can't match this. You should be afraid. Today, only about a dozen P-47 Thunderbolts are still in flying condition. When they appear at air shows, crowds gather to hear that distinctive R-2800 engine sound. It's thrilling now. It's the sound of history, of victory, of freedom preserved. But for the dwindling number of German veterans still alive, it's still the sound of death. In 2018, Klaus Weber, Frank Weber's grandson, attended the Thunder over Michigan air show. A P-47 was performing. When the engine started, Klaus recorded the sound on his phone. Later, he played it for his grandfather, now 93 years old. Frank Weber listened for 5 seconds, then asked Klaus to stop it. His hands were shaking. When Klaus apologized, Frank said something that perfectly captures the complex legacy of these machines. He said, "Don't apologize. That's the sound that ended the war. That's the sound that defeated Nazism. That's the sound of the side that should have won, winning. Yes, it traumatized me. Yes, it still frightens me. But the world needed that sound. Your generation lives in freedom because young Americans climbed into those machines and made that sound mean something. Don't apologize for playing it. Respect it. That respect goes both ways. The men who flew P-47 Thunderbolts, who maintained them, who built them in American factories, they were doing a job that needed doing. They weren't trying to create trauma. They were trying to win a war and save lives and go home. The fact that their aircraft's engine created an acoustic signature that became a weapon in itself. That's a testament to American engineering and American industrial capacity. You just discovered why German veterans trembled when describing a sound. Why, decades after the war, old men would have panic attacks triggered by traffic noise or thunderstorms. Why the Pratt and Whitney R-2800 engine became the accidental soundtrack of psychological defeat. This history was buried in veterans' oral history projects and German military archives. Corporate documentaries don't tell these stories because they don't fit the simple narrative. But this is the real history, messy, complex, psychologically devastating. American air power didn't just destroy German military capability, it destroyed German military psychology, one P-47 engine roar at a time. If this story matters to you, If you believe the greatest generation's technological achievements should be remembered, super thanks isn't just channel support. It's you saying, the men who flew P-47s deserve to be remembered. It's you saying industrial capacity won the war. It tells YouTube that real history, with all its psychological complexity, matters. It keeps these stories alive for your grandchildren. Every super thanks helps preserve another layer of this history. You're not supporting me. You're paying tribute to the pilots who climbed into those Thunderbolts, the crew chiefs who kept them in the air, and yes, even the German soldiers whose trauma serves as a stark reminder of the true cost of war, the freedom you cherish, the world that was spared from the clutches of fascism. It was all safeguarded by a multitude of factors: brave soldiers, strategic genius, Allied cooperation, and the deep, thundering roar of 15,677 P-47 Thunderbolts, powered by what is considered the most reliable high-power engine ever conceived, flown by young Americans who simply wanted to do their duty and return home, meticulously maintained by women like Rosie the Riveter, who toiled through countless night shifts, ensuring they stayed airborne, all culminating in a sound that screamed to the enemy. You're facing the full industrial might of America, and your defeat is inevitable. You're not just watching a video. You are becoming a guardian, a custodian of historical narratives, often overlooked by mainstream institutions. You're honoring the sound that helped bring an end to the war. Please share your family's stories down below. My viewers have contributed the most incredible experiences. Grandfathers who piloted P-47s, grandmothers who helped construct them, even accounts from German veterans' families, sharing their complex journeys of trauma and healing, each story posted in the comments. It's a tangible piece of history. If you remember your family telling you about the unique sound of specific aircraft, please tell us. This is how we safeguard narratives that museums often struggle to capture.